What is up, everybody? My name is James D. Fiore, and this is Blackball. There are certain issues that creep up from time to time that tend to challenge narratives, tend to challenge groupthink, and just honestly tend to challenge just the wherewithal that people have when it comes to examining the full thrust of facts and elements and citations and whatever else of a certain particular story. And one such thing happened a few years ago. If the numbers 215 and 751 ring a bell with anybody out there, there's probably a good reason for that. What they refer to is the alleged number of graves found in mass graves found in Kamloops and Powell River, 251 and 215, and 751 respectively. And it took the media and this country, and to a certain extent, many parts of the world by storm, because it generally implied that Canada was guilty with an assist, I guess you would say, to the Catholic Church, was guilty of committing genocide against Indigenous children through these residential schools by murdering them and then burying them in apple orchards and other places surrounding the church and residential school that was adjacent or close by. And personally, even when I found out that this may have taken place, I was completely shocked, and I think most people that I know were completely shocked. But then something started to happen where, and you had to really kind of look for it because the media was not having any of it. There were people that started to challenge that narrative, saying that, you know what, maybe we should take a closer look at this. Maybe we need to try to figure out exactly what happened before we start, sounding the alarm. Something that cataclysmic probably needs the data to back it up. And then I stumbled upon this on YouTube. It's called What Remains. And the person responsible largely for that documentary is my guest today. And her name is Professor Frances Widdowson. Professor, how are you today?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Now, I've emptied out my email inbox to make room for all the hate mail I'm probably going to get. But I really want to have like the kind of discussion, because I told you before we went on air, I don't really have a dog in the ideological fight. Like there's a part of me that leans left on certain things, right on certain things. I really kind of appreciate the heterodox position a lot of times as well, because then you don't really have to plant a flag anywhere. But tell me the beginnings of this story and how it became such an accepted narrative, and then what happened to change all that.
So the beginnings of the story were that on May 27th, 2021, the Kamloops Indian Band put out a press release saying that the remains of 215 children had been confirmed at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School, and that some of the children were as young as 3 years old. So that came out, and immediately there was this, what appears now to be somewhat of a mass hysteria, where everyone across the country was in this state of mourning, and there was memorials, and there was the flag. The Canadian flag was lowered to half-mast. And then we got other announcements quite soon after that. And the 751 was the next one, but that was not in Powell River. I should just, it's a little bit confusing, all these places, but that was in Excavations, which was in Saskatchewan. And again, like leaders, for example, the leader of the New Democratic Party, Jagmeet Singh, said that this was evidence of genocide. And Justin Trudeau, who was the leader, the prime minister, went and had a teddy bear where he knelt down on the site of Excavations. And there was a number of others, and there was this kind of ongoing tally. And then on July 15th, we heard that from the ground penetrating radar person who had done the survey, Sarah Bollier from the University of Fraser Valley, that there was not 215 remains found. There was 200 targets of interest on the GPR. And the reason why it went from 215 to 200 was because the archaeological department at Simon Fraser University had done excavations in a particular area where she had surveyed, and therefore those 15 were going to be discounted. But of course, that raises the question, if she made a mistake on the 15, maybe the others were false positives as well, and therefore they were other kinds of excavations that had taken place on the site. So that all has continued to happen. And even though it was stated on July 15th, 2021, that it was not remains, the band continued to make these claims in a whole variety of different contexts. The media didn't seem to be able to correct itself very much. And we still have ongoing, kinds of claims about the unmarked graves, when what we're talking about is people who have relatives buried in cemeteries which were marked originally, and then now, because they were wooden crosses, those crosses have deteriorated, and so you have unmarked graves in cemeteries which people have lost track of, and they're trying to find out where their relatives are buried. But that's a completely different issue. Yeah. The cemeteries and locating where people are buried in cemeteries versus mass graves and mass murder and genocide and all these kinds of claims. So, and we're still trying to work through this, and we need a reckoning, because the band received $12.1 million for excavations to do excavations between 2021 and 2023. And they have not done those excavations. And that's the only way we're going to get to the truth of this matter.
Yeah, it seems to me that you would want to have a story like this to be as accurate as possible. Like, the truth is really kind of important. Yes. When you're dealing with actual bodies of children. And I don't know how to say this without sounding horrible, but I mean, I don't want it to be true. I don't want to know that there's a bunch of children that were murdered by nuns and priests and things like that, and put in boxes and incinerated or whatever all those other stories are. Like, I don't want, but there seems to be people that kind of want it to be true. And I'm wondering, what is their motive? Now, I know that we can't just put a blanket over everybody, but I'm sure there's some that fall into pile A and some that fall into pile B. But I wonder what the ratio is between people that believe it's true and are honestly just so hurt that they don't even want to hear any other arguments because, oh my God. And then the people that are like nefariously projecting this falsehood on purpose for means or money. Like, I don't really, do you have an idea of how that ratio pans out, or?
It's hard to tell. There is a lot of money to be made from this claim, which we have seen hundreds of millions of dollars be dispersed concerning it. And not just that, it also softened up a whole bunch of initiatives which are going to have massive implications for Canada, such as the pushing through of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So it had a lot of other lawsuits were able to be pushed through as well. So it's not just the money for the unmarked graves, searches and so on. It's money that's going to be made through various legal disputes that are put forward by what's called the Aboriginal industry, which is a group of lawyers and consultants that work for Aboriginal organizations to extract funds. So there's a very self-serving, nefarious group that is doing this. But then you have the Aboriginal leadership. And to be honest with you, I have no idea whether they believe this or not. Because there's a man by the name of Ted Godfredson Jr., who's a major figure in the Kamloops band. And he says things which makes me think he doesn't really understand what's going on. Like, he'll say anomalies sometimes, and he'll say children other times. He doesn't seem to really be making any distinction between, GPR findings, which are uncertain, and, conclusive evidence that there are remains actually discovered. This doesn't seem to be understood very well in many corners of the Aboriginal leadership. So, certainly a lot of people can very, very sincerely believe it. And because you're supposed to believe the elders, that's the nature of Aboriginal culture, it's very, very difficult to challenge people who are considered to be what is called quote unquote knowledge keepers. It's very rude and disrespectful to challenge what they say. So if the knowledge keepers are saying that there's children buried in the apple orchard, you've got to believe them. That's kind of the approach that you see in with respect to Aboriginal politics.
I don't know about Aboriginal politics, but in journalism, there's things called secondary and tertiary sources and things like that. So,
Yeah.
and listen, like there is a part of me that has a reflex inside where I want to pay some sort of deference or respect to Aboriginal history. And so, for example, as an atheist, it's hard for me to identify with the idea of a grave being sacred in the sense that you don't want to disturb it because there's sacredness to it. But I kind of respect the idea of it because I was raised Catholic, and I think it's the same that universally among all religions. However, you're talking about a crime, though. This
Yeah.
should be seen as a crime scene, I think, right? And I keep on reverting back to this idea that I don't want it to be true. So, how do you find out if it's true? Like, are we allowed to? Or have they put a ban on excavation? Like, can we do partial excavation, or does that disrupt the spirit? Like, and I'm not trying to be an asshole about this. I swear to God, I'm just trying to figure out how to confirm all this so that then we can get to the bottom of it, and no one has to argue anymore.
Yeah, the story keeps on changing, so it's hard to figure out what the latest position is. But in, I believe it was January 2022, so that's the first time I heard of it publicly. It was stated by the Kamloops Indian Band that the heads of the 13 families had agreed to exhume the bodies in the
Okay.
apple orchard. Now, of course, to say
Can you give
exhume,
our audience an idea what the 13 families are? Because to me that
so
sounds like mafia, and I know it's not. So
well, it's tribal, so it has similar tribal characteristics, and
right.
there's anyway. So you have in these tribal groupings, you have important lineages that exist within these tribal groupings, and evidently for the Kamloops Indian Band, there's 13 very important families, and those 13 families have the heads of those families, and they come together in a kind of a council and
Okay.
make
So it's like
decisions.
influential family
Yes,
lineages. Okay.
which is
Got it.
different from the band councilors who are elected by the represent like I guess they have individual band members elect their council and so on. So
Okay.
that's part of another regime. But the 13 family head seems to be more of a traditional kind of system that operates in parallel with the elected representatives. No one has really gone into and done a deep dive as to. We just kind of heard this on
Okay.
this
Sorry,
program as a
I
speaking
didn't mean to
speaker.
sidetrack it or anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, they said this, or according to Manny Jules and Ted Godfreyson, who are two major representatives of the band, they said that the family heads had agreed to exhume the bodies, but of course, in order to exhume, you have to have bodies there. So we first need to figure out whether there are bodies there before we can exhume, and it's highly improbable that there are bodies buried in this apple orchard because not one parent has said that their child never came home from the Kamloops Senior Residential School. So if that's the case, who are the 200 bodies that are buried in the apple orchard? And the other interesting question is, why did the band say children as young as 3 years old? Like that, where did they get that? And this appears to be the GPR surveyor implanting this idea in the band's mind by saying that when she's looking at these anomalies, they're small, and so they must be small children or something like that. And I've seen another archaeologist do this. His name is Terrence Clark, and he works for the University of Saskatchewan. He's a professor. You see him on camera in what remains saying to a group of students, you can imagine a child lying on its side in this kind of hole or whatever. And it's like, he has no business doing that. He does not know that at all. And he makes all these students cry when he says this to them. So there's a lot of manipulation, a lot of emotional manipulation that is going on. And this really needs to be exposed.
You mentioned that there are no records of parents claiming that their children didn't come home. Um, I'm not trying to play devil's advocate, but I'm curious, how robust were the records in the Kamloops school so that we could be able to figure out if there were any, you know, if numbers sort of coincided with what the record keeping said there were at the school at the time. Sorry, I jumbled
This
up that question. I think you know what I
no,
mean.
no, it's very important. There's gaps in the records.
Mhm.
We have a great researcher who's known as Nina, whose name is Nina Green, who's done most of the research on the Kamloops case. One of the problems is the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, which has a trust deed with the University of Manitoba, is kind of the repository of all the records for the residential schools that are being kind of accumulated. They're supposed to be allowing the public to access those records, and they've been keeping them behind closed doors. So that's another problem that we're currently trying to work through. But Nina, in her research, there's there's a registry which notes the number of children associated with the Kamloops Indian Residential School who died, and there's 49 children who have been identified by name who are associated with the Kamloops Indian Residential School. But they and Nina has worked hard along with Jacques Riyard, who's a professor from the University of Montreal, to get the death certificates for those, and they've obtained about 35 of the death certificates, and 25 of those children did not die at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. They died in hospitals or in accidents on their home reserves, and we have the cemeteries where those 35 children are buried. So there's no mystery there. The other 14, we're still working on trying to figure them out. But whether that 49 accurately represents the number of children who died at the residential school is not all that clear right now. So we're working on that. But the main question is that there's no police reports or anything like that of children going missing from the Kamloops Indian Residential School. Now, it could be that parents were too afraid to talk to the RCMP or something. Like, there could be extenuating circumstances, but that needs to be substantiated. We need the names of the children who went missing, when they went missing, what were the circumstances that surrounded this, and no one has put forth any information like that. It's all just kind of vague hearsay types of references.
When I was watching the documentary "What Remains," there was a couple things that stuck out, but I want to preamble this by, I thought that when I was doing my Francis deep dive, I was kind of shocked at the idea that, you know, a lot of people were calling you racist and a lot of people were calling you very unflattering things. I mean, maybe you can just humor me and answer a hypothetical for me. You would be appalled if you found out that 751 children were buried in Powell River or 215 kids were buried in Kamloops in an apple orchard with unmarked graves. Like, this would be something that would shock you, and you would not be taking a position where you would try to explain it away. Can you offer that so that someone has a soundbite out there of you being like, yes, it would be a horrible thing? Like,
definitely, we do have in the historical record instances of a whole bunch of people being murdered and thrown into mass graves. And that is a very, very shocking and upsetting circumstance, which obviously, especially if it's children, one would be, mortified about this occurring. So, this is how one responds to anything like that, whether it be Rwanda or the Holocaust or Bosnia or any of these instances where this does happen. It is a absolutely shocking situation. But, in the Canadian case, we do have a number of episodes where people should not be, happy about what happened historically, but you don't really have any situations of mass killings that existed in Canada. So we're talking about, this gets into all the discussions about the residential schools and whether they were terrible or whether they had problems or whether they were a good thing. And I don't think they're a good thing. I think there's lots of problems with the residential schools, but I know people who do argue that, and with evidence, not just, talking off the top of their head. Michelle Sterling is one of them, who says that the residential schools were a much needed institution to be involved in assisting the child welfare function because of the serious breakdown that was happening in the communities. So
Yeah, I've seen arguments like that as well. I would put myself in the camp of I don't think that they were a good thing. Sort of like the arsonist that wants credit for putting out the fire he started, but you know what I mean, like the assimilation process or the I mean, like I know it's a term that's thrown around a lot in 2025, but colonialism was good for one side and bad for the other side. Let's just face it. And and their lives may have been the way that they were before we got there, and it may not always have been positive, but it was still a self-determination thing. And anyways, I don't want to get sidetracked on that for a second, but you know what I mean? Because that's another podcast.
Yes.
But what I noticed though, when watching What Remains, is that in the face of just, the evidence that at the very least, this is still an open question, right? Like regarding mass graves and what's underneath the ground. Because until people go under the ground, no one's really going to have the most robust argument that they could possibly have. But in the face of that, there was, it was Carrie, I can't remember what her name was, but there was somebody in the documentary where it was almost like they were making the argument, well, who cares if it's true?
Valentina was the
and that smile, I was just like, geez, like I had an ex-girlfriend that smiled at me like that
too. Like this is once you start to get and it's a bit of an evasive maneuver, because you argue, like for 4 years now, I've been on a research group where we have just been arguing the facts on this relentlessly. And now when it looks like finally people are saying, okay, this looks like a bit of an implausible kind of scenario, you get what does it matter anyway? Because Aboriginal people have been so poorly treated that the fact that they misuse public funds, that's really doesn't really matter. And like, there's lots of corruption everywhere anyway. So why are you picking on the Aboriginal representatives?
Yeah, that's such a hollow argument. That's really, really bad. And it's always been bad. No matter where it's applied. You mostly see it from the left, to be honest with you. Like that whole ends justify the means kind of argument, where you see it in on the right in fascism, and the left you see it in socialism. But the idea that propaganda can sell whatever it wants to sell as long as the end goal is achieved, and that becomes, and you see that a lot on campuses now, don't you? And you have a pretty you have an asterisk in your career based on this whole clash of ideology and college campuses sort of colliding. Can you tell us about that a little bit? I read about it, but I don't want to butcher it, because I found that even the people that said that decided that you were treated, I believe the word they used was disproportionately, they still had room to criticize the hell out of you.
Yeah. So I was found to have been wrongfully terminated.
Yeah.
By arbitrator David Philip Jones, who I don't have very many good words to say about him, because he was a glorified note taker and did not do his job, despite being paid probably $800 an hour to do this. We don't know the exact numbers, but millions of dollars have been spent on my arbitration case over ridiculous things, and Mount Royal should be held to account for what it has done, which was essentially trying to push me out because my views were upsetting prized indigenization assets like Gabrielle Lindstrom, who that was her name then, and now she goes by her maiden name, Gabrielle Weaselhead. People really wanted her to be at the university, and she said that she felt unsafe by the arguments that I was making about, the fact that Indigenous science didn't really seem to be a science, and that the residential schools weren't genocidal. And this was very upsetting to her. And people wanted her to remain at Mount Royal. And if Gabrielle Weaselhead is upset, Francis Widdowson has got to go. That's basically what happened.
Right.
And so now I'm demanding that I be reinstated at Mount Royal University, and that university be held to account for basically complete violations of academic freedom. And it is not an academic institution anymore, the way it is operating. And it is quite shocking. I've just been doing a deep dive into all their videos, and it's embarrassing. It's completely embarrassing what's going on, because it's been taken over by indigenization activists. Anyway, so that the residential schools were heavily wound up with all that was going on, is because when I first heard about, first of all, there's the genocide question, where the residential schools were genocidal. And I always asserted that they were not. And I have reasons for why I argue that they are not. And I do not accept the term cultural genocide, which was the language adopted by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But in 2020, the governance body that makes decisions for the entire university had a resolution where they stated that the residential schools were genocidal. They did that, and I thought that was a huge mistake, and was going to poison my environment, my work environment, because now people would say, well, this is our policy, this is what we believe, and here's Francis Widdowson, who's going around, arguing against this position. And that was true. That turned out to be true, because all these students were all making these arguments, and it was becoming more and more hostile for me to be working at that institution. But, I have a lot of recommendations for how Mount Royal can get back on an academic path. And I'm looking forward to going back in there to, to make these arguments so that we can have an actual institution, because Mount Royal was a wonderful institution in 2008 when I came there. It was incredible. We had incredible administrators, Robin Fisher and Manuel Merton, and they knew what an academic institution was, and they protected me when I was there, because they said, well, you need to have unpopular ideas expressed, at a university, because that's how, we have a process of disputation that occurs. And I could be wrong, but hearing my views allows people who are arguing against me to make their ideas stronger. And that's very, very important. And that is over in universities.
That's like the first principle of sound debating, is to be able to go to the other podium and argue the other side, right? Like that, wasn't that the very first thing that they teach you in debate club?
Yeah. Well, in the scientific method, it's a disputational process. Right. You're not trying to prove your ideas, you're trying to disprove your ideas. And if you prevent any dissent from being expressed at the university, which is what's happened, you're not going to be able to figure things out at all. And that's why we have this catastrophe. We have a number of catastrophes unfolding in Canada, the unmarked graves issue. The whole Indigenous policy area is a complete disaster, because you cannot have criticism of what these Indigenous activists are arguing.
I don't know if we differ on this or not, but we probably do a little bit. What would you call, if you're not cultural genocide, what would you call it when a people are colonialized and their self-determination is taken away? I'm not being a dick about it.
Assimilation.
I just don't know.
So that was an assimilation process in Canada. It was a very harsh. It was very, very harsh. So I personally argue for what's called integration, which is not got the coercive kind of character as assimilation. So with the residential schools, there are two major problems, and I'm an atheist as well, so this enables me to be very critical of the churches. It should not have been turned to the churches, the educational process, because you have all sorts of problems that occur with that. And secondly, there was a great deal of insensitivity to the Aboriginal population and the difficulties that they were experiencing in the process of the meeting of two vastly different, kind of types of societies. So they were dislocated. They had all sorts of difficulties, and there was a lot of insensitivity. So it really made the whole process of coming together very, very difficult.
These are really like poignant questions too, because as you if you look at what's going on in the world as far as conflicts go, a lot of them have to do with not only who were indigenous to these areas first, but even disagreements on who was indigenous to these areas. When you look at Israel and Gaza, when you look at Ukraine and Russia, like these integrative cultural aspects, and who got there first and how long it's been since they've been there and things like that, we don't really have like there's no universal kind of answer to the question of how long before, like, what's the shelf life on colonial assimilation before it gets just accepted and we move on. Like, I don't know what the answer is, because I only know what it's like, I guess, to be on the winning side. Like, I don't know, but are there any bodies, government, not governmental bodies, but maybe committees that even tackle these kinds of questions? Or is it just really like, it just goes on forever and one side just keeps on trying to get back what they lost 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago, or whatever the case happens to be?
Well, you have many academic arguments about what is the the most just way to move forward, and it really depends upon one's political ideology as to what is going to be accepted. Which people might be surprised to learn, am a socialist, and I'm a follower of George Orwell. George Orwell was a socialist, for people who don't know that too. Mm-hmm. And George Orwell was concerned about capitalism and all the injustices of capitalism, but he was also very concerned about the tendency of socialism to become authoritarian. So he was very concerned about the issues of freedom and how to maintain that in the context of trying to develop a more just economic system than the capitalist system. So I find his ideas to be very fascinating and persuasive. In terms of being able to have a just system, you have to sincerely address the grievances of the group that has been brought under this colonial regime. And that's not happened in the case of Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal relations. And in the 1960s, this got taken over by the Aboriginal industry, which has made things much, much worse than what they were before the 1960s, because what the Aboriginal industry does is that it manufactures legal grievances to siphon money away from Aboriginal communities. So you have absolute state of emergency conditions in isolated Aboriginal communities. It's estimated fetal alcohol syndrome rates are at 40% in these communities, and no hope whatsoever in these communities because they have no economic base and no hope of ever having an economic base. So those people are just being warehoused in these small, really remote communities, and the industry just makes money off of it. It is actually quite grotesque what's happening, and it's justified by these neo-tribal elites who live in completely integrated settings in downtown cities and are able to function perfectly well, but they advocate for the continued dependency and isolation of these marginalized Aboriginal communities.
Yeah, that's another thing that people have a hard time discussing, is the idea that human beings can be corrupted. That includes human beings that live as band leaders on reserve sometimes.
Exactly. Yeah, and they are very corrupt. And it's not even to blame them for it. If you are living in one of those communities, that's how politics operates. If you're not going to be the corrupt one who's taking all the money for your friends and relatives, your adversary is going to be in power taking the money for all their friends and relatives. Like, that's how politics works in Aboriginal communities. So what needs to be worked through is how do you create a system which can, satisfy the needs of everyone in whatever context, not just shifting back and forth between one corrupt entity and another.
Is there a place, and this is a question out of left field a little bit, but as you're talking, I'm thinking of polarization, and I'm thinking about how it poisons everything. Christopher Hitchens had a book, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. I would write, if I were ever to write a book adjacent to that, although probably not as eloquent because he's amazing, it would be How Polarization Poisons Everything. And Are we missing civics as a educational tool, not just in high school, but even in elementary school, like grade 8? To teach kids how to maybe kind of educate the polarized viewpoints out of our society so that we don't always look at everything as an all or nothing proposition.
Well, and this is where the universities and the school system. I hate to even think what's going on in the school system, because then you're downstream of that in the university system. But the university system is what I'm most familiar with, and because you do not allow discussion in the university system, you cannot have that kind of process where you can maybe not agree with someone, but you can at least accurately understand what their position is. And I'm doing this now all across the country with a method, and you probably heard of it. It's developed by Peter Boghossian,
Mm.
who was a professor at Portland State. It's called Spectrum Street Epistemology. And what we need to do at the universities is go into all of them with the Spectrum Street Epistemology method and allow people to state what they believe to be true, and then try to articulate why they believe this. And I just did this at Thompson Rivers University on the claim the remains of 215 children have been found at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. And we had two people, Jenna and Hal. Jenna strongly believed that remains had been found. 215 remains had been found.
Classic
Hal
Jenna. Yeah.
strongly, Hal strongly disagreed. And the reason why Jenna believed this was because she thought excavations had been done. Like she thought that there had been actual excavations taking place.
Well, she has a case to blame the media for that too, though. Like,
Yeah.
even if they don't implicitly state excavations have taken place, they use like one small adverb in front of a very declarative statement that basically says remains found in Kamloops. Like, you know what I mean? Like they apparent, like for example, that's a big one that they use. Big protests are happening in Kamloops after apparent mass grave found last week, and then they just keep going and meander, and it's like, but you didn't really say it, and so you start to wonder if editors and producers and people in media group, do they know what yourself and others know, and they're just they just want the clicks, or do you think that they're also very blinded by their own sort of narrative and relativism and ideology and things like that? Like, or like, I really hate to think of it as nefarious as that. You said something, sorry, I'm rambling, but you said something in the documentary about how the insidious, I'm paraphrasing, the insidious nature of the media is not them lying to you, but it's often lying through omission.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah.
I'm dealing with a story right now in Alberta, where on the face of it, it looks like a procurement scandal between a vendor and the UCP government, who have friendly relations. But then once you look under the hood, you realize that the Globe and Mail, their star witness and their main source, allegedly, appears to be someone who's really kind of corrupt and has a shady history. And then you find out that a political operative is like feeding a whole bunch of disinformation and everything, and you're like, you try to report on that and they just block you out, as if the stuff that we're saying on our podcast, and then they cover it and they say that we're agents of political interference rather than just people that are just trying to tell the whole truth. And it's a very weird place right now.
And Simon Hergott, who's the major player in the document, he's the writer, narrator, and videographer, incredible talent. He was a journalist at the time working for Global News, and was fired I'm not sure what year he was fired, because he was trying to challenge various stories that the media was taking a position on. And he said that his employer was not open to really doing a hard-hitting investigative piece on the Kamloops case. And I think part of it now is it's just so embarrassing what has happened. And as well, university presidents, making all sorts of claims. Those university presidents, like the president of my university, Tim Raleigh, who, yep, got on, the video and said, children buried in Kamloops, he should, sponsor an event to set the record straight on what happened in Kamloops, because he was actively involved in misinforming the Canadian public, and yet that video is still on Mount Royal's website, and
Wow.
no one has said anything about it. No one has tried to, and that's the same with the media, is that the media really needs to come out and say, look, we made some mistakes here. We didn't understand GPR, and everything just kind of got ahead of us, and we didn't we now need to have a reckoning about this, especially doing a hard hitting coverage of why excavations have not been done at Kamloops. The fact that excavations have not been done, that is a shocking situation, because it's not doing the excavations which is preventing us from actually being able to understand the reality, because we won't, until excavations are done, it's always possible that there could be remains there. Like, that is a possibility. But until we do the excavations, we can have no closure on this situation.
I mean, I'll ask you to speculate for a second, but a number of these organizations, are they worried about liability for spreading falsehoods,
Well,
collecting money maybe when they shouldn't have, when
I
they
think they
knew?
just, they realize that they've got a goose who lays golden eggs here by having everyone believe that there's remains there. And if they do the excavations, they open up the possibility that there might not be remains there. And they don't want that possibility to be there. And there was
That
one
is
excavation that
such
was
a
done, yeah,
Yeah,
on
sorry.
Pine
It's
Creek
so
in Manitoba.
disgusting. It's so disgusting because you're talking about the idea of dead children. Like I can't get past that part. I interview, I've interviewed dozens of ex cult members from this one specific cult called the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. And the one overarching nefarious thing that really bothers me about this church, and there's so many things, but one of those things happens to be the weaponization of faith, like the fear of God, or the fear of being excommunicated, the fear of not being seen as one of God's chosen people, and how powerfully impactful that is on a person who's only known one type of life, born into it. Cult life is forever. This is normalcy to me, right? And the idea that you can weaponize, just to sort of bring it back here, I'll calm down now, everybody, but I'm just sort of bring it back here, the weaponization of people's ingrained empathy and heartbreak for dead children.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
that is disgusting. And I think everyone should want, I don't care what side of the spectrum you're on, you're good. You want to know if this is real or not. So you know if you're being manipulated, or you know if you should be like feeling grief. Because I think
Yeah.
all of us would feel grief. I felt it
Yeah.
when I first heard about the story. I'm a father of two. I'm not, inhuman, and I probably wouldn't even have to be a father of two to feel what I felt, which was like horror. I remember putting my hand in front of my mouth and going, "This is unspeakable. This is crazy." But
Yeah.
if it's not true, I think we should know.
So there was one excavation that was done at Pine Creek, or there's been other excavations of, but this one was in the context of the current, hysteria that was unfolding. So Derek Nepanak, I believe his name is, credit to him, because the knowledge keepers, etc., were saying that they believe that children were buried in the basement of this church. And so he said we should know whether this is the case. We should definitively know, and the only way we're going to do this is to look at this. And so he got someone with GPR to go down there, and there were 14 anomalies that looked like that they were going to be burials in the basement. He got the archaeologist to come in and do the excavations, and they found that they were rocks in the basement of the church.
Wow.
So that is the one episode that we've had done recently, which tries to figure out whether it's true or not, in the only way you can find out if it's true. Sadly, on a more kind of depressing note, is the recent announcement that was made a week ago concerning the Cooper Island Residential School, which is on the, I believe it's in the Georgia Strait. I'm not exactly sure. It's northern, or it's close to Vancouver Island, northern Vancouver Island.
Okay.
Anyway, they've done GPR over some cemeteries at Cooper Island. Andrew Martindale is the archaeologist from University of British Columbia. This, in my view, is malpractice because he is encouraging Aboriginal people to believe that there are unmarked graves at Cooper Island. And he said this completely bizarre statement publicly. I have the clip that I posted on my Twitter account, that there were, and I don't know the exact numbers, 344 unmarked graves. 100 and something are possible of these. 100 of these are possible graves. Another 100 are likely graves, and another 100 are probable graves. Those four sentences do not correspond with one another.
No,
like you've got
that's called covering yourself legally. I think.
But he said that there's unmarked graves. Like, so that to me, and so all these Aboriginal people who are associated with Cooper Island, there's this huge emotive thing with all these people with orange shirts, and all the media cares about when it's interviewing these people is, you know, isn't residential school denialism terrible? And how are you guys going to handle the residential school denialism, which is people like me asking these kinds of questions on your program? I'm saying and the other thing I should mention about Cooper Island, which I found to be quite shocking, was Andrew Martindale, this archaeologist from UBC, is talking about some hearsay of a child who was pushed out of a three-story window by a nun, and that nun buried that child by a tree stump. And he was told by an elder the exact location where that child was buried. Okay, so that's a crime scene where a child was murdered by a nun. Let's go and excavate and get the remains of that child, figure out who that child is, and figure out how that child died. And that has not happened at all. So you have this very, very irresponsible statement made by this archaeologist. He should be held to account by his institution by doing these kinds of things. And this is happening time and time again. We are having these professors who are acting in an unbelievably unprofessional and unethical way, stirring up trauma within Aboriginal communities so that they can get more GPR searches and more money that can be diverted to all these Aboriginal industry processes.
Yeah, that's the big thing. The trauma amongst Aboriginal and Indigenous communities must be terrifying, because the people that are kind of leading the charge, I always think this about cult leaders too. The cult leaders and the elders within the cult, they know that it's not real, right? They know what they're doing, right? The guy in the leader of the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church is a guy named Bruce Hales out of Australia, who says that he talks to Jesus, literally like, yeah, I spoke with Jesus last night. It was good. You know, whatever. He's saying that we have to keep going on Q3 with this business and that. Like, honestly, he says stuff like that. And it's not for comic relief. So you always seem to have leaders that will push a narrative that they know isn't true in order to manipulate the people that follow. Yep. And I find it so disgusting and gross. And I don't know why. I guess I know why we're not allowed to say it, because of that polarization question again, and the whole punching down idea and everything. And it's just like, it's ludicrous, because, a lie will fix financial problems for people really quickly, but the truth, takes its time to sort of remedy the lie, right? Like, it takes forever.
Yeah. It's almost impossible to dislodge. We'll see. I think it's 2023, Eric Kaufman did a survey, and at that time, 60% of Canadians believed that a mass grave had been found in Kamloops, and only 15% disagreed.
I'm surprised it was that low. Seriously.
Anyway, Angus Reid has just recently done another one. We don't know the results of it yet, but evidently there is quite a shift. From 60 to much less than 60. I don't know what the numbers are going to be. So there has been a bit of a shift that's happened, but there's a lot of dishonesty going on, and a lot of people think it's fine to be dishonest to Aboriginal people because it makes them feel good. Like that's essentially the argument.
It's infantilizing.
This is a terrible, terrible thing to do, and this will have consequences, far-reaching consequences, when Aboriginal people find out that they have been manipulated and lied to.
Yeah.
They are going to be incredibly angry about this, and rightfully so. And I know a lot of Aboriginal people are angry at me because of my truth telling that I'm doing, but I'm doing this because I respect them. I respect them as human beings who deserve the truth just as much as anyone else deserves the truth. And I'm not going to lie to them. I'm going to tell them what I honestly think is true. Now, I could obviously be wrong about many of my arguments and positions, but the only way we're going to sort things out if people honestly, state what they're thinking. And there's a whole bunch of people who are not doing that, and as a result, we can't find our way forward. We're just lost. And then the worst is people who say the truth doesn't matter anyway.
Yeah,
like, well,
that was
this
Valentina. Valentina needs to come on the show. We need to have a talk. No, but you know what? We're in a, if I may offer some unsolicited advice, we're in a political and social climate these days where the juxtaposition of your position on this matter and the fact that you're a socialist, and I'm not being funny, might serve you well if you opened with that. Seriously.
Oh, I am open with it. It's just that people keep on calling me a Nazi and all these sorts of things. So,
I would call myself, hi, I'm Socialist Francis Widdowson. That's what I would do. You know what I mean?
Orwellian socialist. It's on my Twitter. It's on my Facebook account. So
yeah,
Orwellian socialist. That's what I am. I'm an Orwellian socialist because, I do see the problems with, some of the tendencies. And as George Orwell said, this is kind of interesting when he was talking about why people are opposed to socialism. And he said there's two reasons why people are opposed to socialism. The first one is socialists, because you have all these kind of
you could have just stopped there. I got it.
We're very difficult people. And secondly is the love of the machine, is that socialists tend to just want to mow down the old and bring in a better world. And, this doesn't sit well with many people who are very attached to their traditional ways of living in the world. And that's very disorienting to people. So that's another kind of interesting thought that because I don't really abide by any traditions or anything like that. And I kind of find it hard to, kind of figure out people who are very tied to doing things the way that they used to do them and so on. But still, that's comfortable for people.
And as an atheist, you probably see the sort of theocratic veneer to many socialist groups these days.
Oh yeah, it's dogmatism. So this is the problem: is people have to always consider that they might be wrong, and if you're trying to bring in a new system, it's hard to do that, because if you spend all this time analyzing everything that you're putting forward, you can never bring in a new kind of system. So this is kind of a bit of a difficulty for, sort of revolutionary politics, I guess, is that it tends to have authoritarian dimensions to it.
Is there anything, and we'll wrap with this question, is there anything that's on the horizon that was it, Bill 413?
Yeah, Relia Gazan. Oh my goodness. Yeah.
So tell us about that bill, and then we'll wrap up, because I know that I don't think it's received royal assent yet, because
no, it died. It died on because the election happened, and it's not gone away. This and the media is terrible, because as I mentioned with the Cooper Island thing, the media is asking the Aboriginal leaders, about denialism. So this accusation of residential school denialism is unbelievably authoritarian.
I'm one of those guys, if I may just interrupt for a second, I'm one of those guys that feel like the whole point of free speech is that you can be an asshole. Like if you deny the Holocaust, you're uneducated, ignorant, you're an asshole. But Jesus Christ, don't put the guy in prison. Like, I don't know. That seems like the idea of a slippery slope was literally predicated on something like that.
Yeah. And, we have to appreciate the Americans for their approach, which is, I believe it's called the Brandenburg test, which is incitement. That's not free speech. So if you're inciting
crowded
a criminal act,
yeah,
you're inciting violence. That's not free speech. But everything else is open. It's and if you don't like it, then you need to argue against it. You do not put the person in jail, destroy their livelihood, all these kinds of things which are happening. And these people who are doing this, we are heading in a really terrible direction, because you don't have to look at very many historical examples, Nazi Germany being one of them, where the first thing to go before you had terrible authoritarianism visit upon that society was the clampdowns on speech, the book burning processes, the purging of professors from universities, all these things. That is like, we are on the cusp of that in Canada, and people have to be incredibly serious in opposing these tendencies, and we need to fight hard and fight now before it's all gone, all our free speech protections and all these things in Canadian society.
Francis Widdowson, thank you so much for joining me today. I'd love to have you back sometime.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
That was a good conversation. I'm gonna get hate mail, but I'm gonna figure. One day I'll figure out why. It's just the name that gets triggered, that triggers people, I guess, these days. But that was a very civil conversation. We had a couple points of disagreement, and it was fine. But I learned a lot too, as well. She seems very reasonable. Guys, it's okay if evidence points into a direction that collides with relativism or a narrative that has been adopted by the media, society at large. Even if something comes along that contradicts it, we're supposed to be comfortable enough in our intellectual, status where we can change our opinions based on new evidence. So whatever the case may be, I hope you enjoyed that interview. I have another interview coming up in 2 hours with Jennifer Hyland, who used to be a deputy chief police officer, and now she actually mentors officers who are just coming onto the force. And she's got a lot of sort of insight, not only for policing at large, but also what's happening in Alberta right now. At least I'm going to put her on the spot about that. So we'll see how that goes. But anyways, until then, we will see you next time on Blackball. Blackmore. Blackmore.